Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to start with a musical idea and then work it as a piece of three-part counterpoint. So here is an initial idea. It's kind of in Baroque style, but this is how the initial idea goes that you can see on the screen. So it's a very typical kind of Baroque figure that in contrapuntal music would then be imitated by the instruments playing. And before you get too far into it, you might just consider, well, what's the fundamental way in which I would harmonize this? Not because counterpoint is a harmony exercise. Counterpoint is an exercise in linear writing. But one of the big dangers that people fall into when they try doing this stuff is they get involved in the linear imitation of parts and conversation between parts without thinking enough about the harmony, and then they wonder why it sounds a bit strange. So, okay, this little figure's got an anacrusis at the beginning, but then when you look at it, you sort of think, well, all of this stuff is really chord 1, isn't it? So that's kind of worth knowing. The first 3 notes in that circle belong to chord 1, and the last note in there is a passing note or a passing tone. Now, when you come to the end of that bar, that measure, you might think, well, you know, that could all be chord 1 as well. It could be. It might work better to think of it as chord 5, because then we get a change in the harmony at the end of the bar, and it kind of strengthens the tonality without us getting stuck on one chord. So these are all things to think about before you really kind of get going with your counterpoint. And if you look at this, well, you know, the first note in this group is a harmony note. This note is an upper auxiliary note or an upper neighbor tone. And then when we come here, this is a passing note or a passing tone. And it's also one of those passing notes or passing tones that would turn the 5 into a 5/7, a dominant 7. That's a very typical way of behaving in the Baroque, that you start with a 5 and then you add in the 7th as some kind of decoration, but it just kind of strengthens the harmony as you go. And then when you come to the next bit here, and by the way, this squiggle thing is often used when people are doing exercises in this counterpoint, just to say that's the pitch of the next note, but you're kind of free to do what you like with the rhythm. But this would be a possible return to chord 1. So in other words, the first note inside this circle is a chord tone, a harmony note. The next note here is a passing note or a passing tone. The next note is a chord tone, a harmony note. And the next note here is another passing tone, passing note. So at least before you kind of get stuck into it, you've got some idea how this might harmonize and what the purpose of these notes might be. So if we just do a very fundamental harmonization, and it's very straightforward, I've done this on purpose to try and keep the harmony simple. So we've got 1, 5, 1. Also in 3/4 time, it's not a bad idea to have a harmonic rhythm that takes up a chord for the first 2 beats of the bar and changes on the 3rd beat before moving on to the next bar. So you get this feeling of 1, 2, lift, 1, 2, lift, which kind of enhances the triple meter. So what you don't want is to end up with, when you do your counterpoint, not thinking about the implications of the harmony, not thinking about which are chord tones and which are non-chord tones, or essential notes or inessential notes, and or either that or ending up with a harmonic rhythm that's far too quick, too complicated. I mean, it would be possible, wouldn't it, to kind of go 1, 5, 1, 4, 5, you know, but you don't really want to have all these chords changing so quickly during the bar, the measure. So having some kind of view of it partly depends on tempo. I'm kind of making the assumption that this is going to be a reasonably fast movement. If you were having an adagio or something, well, you could possibly change the chords more frequently. So there's a kind of overview of the given material. So for those of you who are having to do counterpoint for an exam, well, having a look at the given material is not a bad idea. But this isn't just about exams at all, because if you want to write some counterpoint, whatever style you're wanting to write it in, it's not a bad idea to, when you devise the original material, just to think, well, what are the implications for chords? And can I justify the presence of every note? So I haven't got notes that don't belong to the chord that are not non-chord tones. They're all going to throw up trouble for you. And if you're designing an idea, you've got to be sure it's got enough character to play out across a movement, or at least a number of bars, a number of measures. So what we've got here, again, trying to make it not overcomplicated, enough kind of energy in the rhythm to make it interesting, hence these semiquavers, these 16th notes, but also a little kind of balance of chord tones, non-chord tones, harmony notes, inessential notes, and a balance of conjunct and disjunct movement. So you see these notes are just next door to each other, then leap, leap, then it's all going by step after that. So those leaps become a nice balance to the step work that follows. And anything that's a kind of little bit of figuration like this is likely to have quite a lot of stepwise movement. So there we are. There's the original idea that I'm proposing, and just a way of thinking through what that idea is about, or issues you might want to think about in the design of one if you're writing your own. And then you've got to think, okay, what are we doing with this? Well, we're going to set ourselves the challenge of writing this for string trio in a sort of Baroque style. So that's going to be 2 violins and a cello. So let's move on to something I just prepared earlier to speed up this process a bit. Now, what I'm trying to do here is to think about how this imitation would work. And when you're doing this, unlike doing a piece of harmony or a composition where you might be taking a melody and thinking which chord fits this note of the melody, which is the next note of the melody, and what's the chord for that, but thinking this linear design, well, where am I going to get these, what we call points of imitation? So you can see what I'm doing here, that we've got this sort of opening idea, which is the one we've just talked about, and I've put it in the first violin. Okay, and then it's going to wander off somewhere else. Now, what I'm then trying to do is to think, okay, let's have this imitated in the next voice. So the next thing I've done is to put it in the second violin, and then it's kind of extending onwards from there. So that's exactly the same point of imitation, but you'll notice one difference. That is that I've put it in the dominant key. So having had it in G major in the first violin, then I've just given myself a little bit of space across here, because we need to modulate to the dominant key if the next entry is going to come in the dominant key. So then the second violin, you see what's happening? Exactly the same music, but it's in D major. Now, when you're imitating a point, that original idea, you can be absolutely precise with it. You can have it in the same key, but the danger of just kind of repeating it in the same key is you just feel a bit stuck in G major, and you're going to have harmony that keeps going 1, 5, 1 in G major over and over again. If you can modulate to another key, well, we have this sense of movement from the initial point of imitation to that when it comes in the second violin, oh, we've gone somewhere else. So going into D major there. Okay, so that's what's going on there. And then I've just got another little sort of moment where we could just get ourselves back to G major, because then what I'm thinking is that the third entry in the cello is going to be back in the home key. So this is kind of taking us through there in the cello. So you see what's going on there. Now, as this unfolds, then I've got another little sort of linking passage, and you notice I've got this F natural in the cello, because now I'm thinking, well, we don't just want to go G major, D major, G major, D major with these 3 string players for the rest of the time we've got. Let's see if we can go somewhere else. Well, what are the other closely related keys? Well, we've gone from G major to D major. That's the dominant key. We came back to G major. So now I'm thinking, well, why not go to C major, the subdominant key? So now we're back in the first violin. By the way, we don't have to go first violin, second violin, cello, first violin, second violin, cello. We can change the order of events. But here's my next entry. And you'll notice that this is now going on here. But you can see what I've done here at the end of this, a slightly quicker modulation. So I'm just kind of trying to speed up what we're doing. And then we've got this imitation in the second violin. So you can see that here we are again. But what am I doing now? Well, we've kind of moved into F major by the time we kind of get here. So going into F. But then I've introduced this E flat, which kind of maybe suggests we're going into some other key like B flat major or something like that. But you'll notice that things are on the move because this might be in B flat major in bar 8. But then I've got this B natural here. And so you're thinking, oh, okay, so we're not in B flat major. So in other words, as we go through, you might try to find ways of making things a bit more mobile. So we don't just get da-da-dum, bum, 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 ba-da-da-da-dum, 1, 5, 1. Okay, let's pick another key. Where should we go now? But actually trying to make things a little bit more mobile. So by the time we get here, we've got a kind of hint of B flat. But by the time we get to the next bar, we're somewhere else. So we're kind of going back to G again. And then instead of having an entry in the cello, because that would be too predictable, wouldn't it? Violin 1, violin 2, cello, violin 1, violin 2. Oh, the next entry is back in violin 1 again. So, you know, just trying to keep that kind of less predictable. And you can see with the F natural here that we're heading for C major as we cross over into bar 10. Then we've got a little entry in the cello. And you don't have to have the full statement. You know, do you see what I've done here? I've shortened it as we've got going. You know, in the violin 2, we had at the end of bar 7. And then by the time we get to the cello in bar 10, it's actually slightly shortened. Nothing to say you can't do that. You can lengthen it, you can shorten it, you can even modify the intervals. It doesn't have to be precise. You can imitate things rhythmically, you can imitate things melodically. You could do something more sophisticated if you want than we've got room for here. You could augment the rhythm, double the rhythmic values, and diminish the rhythm, halve the rhythmic values. You know, all sorts of things you can do. But I'm just trying to keep this as uncomplicated as I can as a way of kind of getting into, well, how do we deal with counterpoint? And furthermore, how do we deal with 3-part counterpoint, which just has a bit more to it than dealing with 2-part counterpoint. Okay, so we've got this B flat here. So by the time we get here, we've kind of arrived in F, haven't we? Well, we've been to F before, but that's all right. It's not miles away from the home key. And then we've got an E flat here. So we're going to B flat there. And then we've got an A flat here. So you can see we're kind of arriving in E flat here. So we're on the move, aren't we? E flat starting to move quite a long way away from home, aren't we? And then by the time we've got a D flat here, well, we're heading for A flat major. Now, you might be panicking at this point and thinking, well, that's all very well, isn't it? We're kind of working our way around the circle of fifths. Have you noticed? In bar 11, we were in F major with 1 flat. Bar 12, B flat major, 2 flats. Bar 13, E flat major, 3 flats. Bar 14, A flat major, 4 flats. And we're just about to have a cadence in G. So how are we going to get there from A flat major? Well, I'm sort of choosing to finish this exercise in bar 15 just to kind of show you how to do a piece of 3-part counterpoint. The movement will probably be longer. But I'm also just injecting a little harmonic colour here just to show how you could do something like this. So we've arrived in the key of A flat with its 4 flats. How am I then going to get back to G? Because if I think about the ending of this, I'm probably going to need to go from chord 5 to chord 1 in G so that we've got a nice perfect cadence at the end. How am I going to get there from A flat? Well, here's the trick. When you're looking at a chord of A flat major. We might have moved to A flat major from that situation we were in bar 13 in the bass part. But A flat major, while it's the tonic chord of A flat major, is also the Neapolitan chord in G major. Okay, quick reminder on the Neapolitan. A Neapolitan chord is a major chord on the lowered second degree of the scale. So if I'm in G major, there's G. The lowered second degree of the scale, well, the second degree is A, so if I lower it, it's A flat. Build a major chord on A flat, C, E flat, so that's an A flat major chord. Normally a Neapolitan comes in first inversion. So put the C at the bottom, which is exactly what we've got here. And therefore this corner is a tonic in A flat major, but it's also a Neapolitan in G major. So that kind of gets us home, which is quite handy. And then, you know, when you get to this point, you might just think, well, you know, how am I going to finish off this piece then if that's A flat major? You might actually decide that you're going to fill in the end of the piece first, which is another point. You don't have to compose this thing A to Z. You might think, oh, well, I'll get that final cadence in and we'll do that in a moment. But for now, hopefully you can see, you know, how we've got all these little points of imitation kind of switching between the instruments. And, you know, it sort of keeps going, doesn't it? And then here at the end, it's just sort of slightly modified for the final cadence. All right, so I might think, okay, at this point, let's see if we can get a final cadence in. Well, if it's going to go 5-1 in G, well, you know, we probably could just do something like have what I call a hot cross buns cadence. So what do I mean by a hot cross bun cadence? If we're going to go 5-1 at the end, I'm just going to go D, D, G. So if you know that little song, 1 a penny, 2 a penny, hot cross buns. Bit low for me, that. Hot cross buns. It's when you go dominant, dominant, tonic. And normally in Baroque music, certainly you take the upper dominant followed by the lower dominant, and then you've got the tonic in the middle, and it gives you a nice solid cadence. And, you know, we want to fill in the middle part. So we're kind of not worrying too much about the imitation because we're just trying to finish off this extract. So we might, you know, just do something like this, and then we've kind of completed that. So at least we've now got the cadence there. Now, if we want to complete this Neapolitan chord, well, the missing note is E flat. So let's just put that in there. And we could just legitimately decide to turn that bass note there into a minim. And then, you know, we could fill in the top part, say, with something around the Neapolitan that's not out of keeping with the original. So if we do something like this, it's not the only thing you can do, but it just gives you an idea. And you see what I've done now, completed the final cadence. Yeah, so you see what I've done there? I'll just maybe expand that for a moment. Okay, I think actually this would be better written as a B flat. Okay, so you see what I've got now in this situation. We've completed the Neapolitan chord with that harmony, and I'm just keeping these 16th notes going, these semiquavers. So we've got a harmony note, a passing note, a harmony note, a passing note, or a chord tone. And then we're using a passing tone, a chord tone, a passing tone. And that gives us the Neapolitan chord, that, and then the cadence, and then we're kind of home and dry, aren't we? So that's dealt with the end of it. Sometimes just filling in that final cadence is not a bad move. Okay, so now we've kind of planned that, and this is how you might go about it, you see? So you kind of plan all these entries if you're writing imitative counterpoint. It's not the only way to write counterpoint, but it's often a good way to kind of get into it. And we're not going to try and harmonize the opening bars 1 and 2, you could do, but if we want nice clean counterpoint, well, we've just got this single voice, and then the second voice joins it in at the end of the second bar with violin 2, then the third voice joins it when the cello comes in. And then our task is going to be to fill in what's there. So we're constantly thinking about, what we've said about the harmony so far. So we know where we're going with that. So we're outlining this chord 1, this chord 5. I'm purposely just trying to keep it simple. You could do something far more complicated with it, but just thinking if we've got this, in D major, we're thinking 1, 5, 1. So that just helps us to keep a grip on whatever we write in the harmony, in the counterpoint rather, kind of fits with the harmony, so we don't get a load of old random notes. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to fill in the first violin part, and I'll try and do this without taking up too much time. Let's put this in black and then it all fits in. So if we do something like this, hopefully you can see what I'm doing, because what I'm doing is to kind of, hang on a minute, let's just get that lined up more sensibly. Trying to keep in the whole thing in keeping with the original figures. So the rhythmic figures that we've used, and the issue about conjunct movement, balancing with disjunct movement and so on. But you see the sort of thing I'm working in this first violin part for now. We'll sort of unpack what I'm writing in a second. So let's just see what we're doing here. Something like this. And then when we get here, we need to modulate to G major. So I'm just thinking about that for a moment. So this will be a C natural, because we're now heading for G major. Okay, so how about something like this? And then when we get to this point, I'm now thinking, well, we're moving to the key of G, so I'm now thinking 5 to 1 in G. All right, so we've kind of always got our ear on the harmony. Now let's have a look at what I've done there so far. So we've got the opening. Now here comes the second violin, and you hear what I'm doing. That's what we've got so far. So I'm kind of using, in the first violin part, a kind of rhythmic idea from the beginning. We started off with ba-da-dum, and so when I get into bar 3, you'll notice I'm kind of using that. Ya-ta-tum, ta-ta-tum, ta-ta-tum. From this, that figure is coming back, isn't it? And in between, well, we've got notes like just odd quavers, eighth notes. Well, where's that come from? That's come from here. So you see we're kind of drawing on the material, but we're trying to write something as well that blends with that, but is rhythmically a little bit independent. So you'll notice what I've done in bar 3, in measure 3. At the beginning of measure 3, violin 2's got all these quavers, these eighth notes, but I've got a mixture of eighth notes and 16th notes, quavers and semiquavers in the first violin. But at the end of that bar, the end of that measure, I go into 16th notes, semiquavers in the second violin part, but I'm using quavers, eighth notes, in the first violin part. So we get a kind of balance of rhythm. So we're not just going in the same rhythm. If I had done that, it wouldn't have felt quite so contrapuntal, so independent. You'll also notice there's a kind of sense of contramotion about it. I start here and then the parts are working out and then they come back towards each other, then they work out again and then they come back towards each other. So there's a little bit of this sense going as in the design as well. That partly helps you not to write consecutive fifths and octaves and things, but it's also keeping a measure of independence. You've also got to think about the melodic design of things. You know, we don't want a part in the first violin part that's got no kind of character in the rhythm, no kind of melodic character. You know, it'd be quite easy to go. You could do that, and sometimes it's quite effective to have long notes, but it's got far less character than this. So you see how that works. Okay, so on we go. Now, when we come down to measure 5, to bar 5, I'm still sort of keeping half an eye on the whole kind of harmony of this, you know, that we've got still thinking about this 1-5-1 thing. So we're just sort of keeping a grip on that. And now we've got to continue on from the second violin, and we've got to put the first violin as well. So we've got 2 independent parts to stick on top of this bass line. So it starts to get a little bit more complicated, but it's all good fun if you don't weaken. So here's bar 5, and let me just make a suggestion for this. And this is absolutely not the last word on it whatsoever. It's just a possibility. And I'm all the time thinking about using the same kind of rhythmic ideas and thinking about melodic character, thinking about how all this integrates a bit with the given material. Now, that all kind of fits with the 1-5-1 thing, really. There's a little exception that I'm going to come back to in a minute. And then when I do the second violin part, I need to think, can I get a little bit of independence in here? So I'm going to write 16th notes against that first note because the other 2 parts are both using 8th notes. So I'm using semiquavers there instead of quavers at the beginning of the bar. So we've got one moving part there. I'm thinking about harmony, I'm thinking about interaction with both the other parts, I'm thinking about consecutives. So there's quite a lot to kind of ponder, isn't there? But how about something like this? Then it gets busy in the other 2 parts, doesn't it, with semiquavers, 16th notes, so I can afford to slow down the rhythm of the second violin part there, and then on into the next measure. So let's have a look at measure 5 and see what we think. Okay, that all fits, doesn't it? Now, there's just one little thing I've done here, which you'll notice. When we get here, I've just implied a chord 4 going in there. So this is a way of getting a bit of variety into it. Is it always going to go 1-5-1? Or occasionally we're going to do something else that just sort of varies that, slightly jolts the harmonic rhythm so that doesn't become too predictable in its own right. And just that hint of 4 there, you know, what could have been a passing note in the bass, a passing tone, now suddenly becomes harmony. And it just gives you a little sort of jolt there at that point. Okay, now, one of the dangers we can get into is that we can just have everybody playing all the time and it just becomes a kind of mass of 16th notes, semiquavers going in all over the place. And some of the time it's quite good to let a little bit of air into the texture. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort of put a rest in there, and then I'll put one in there as well, so that the next first violin entry sounds quite fresh. So we finish off the last one with, then the first violin has a rest before it goes. So it kind of alleviates the texture a little bit, and also you hear this new entry with great clarity, which does mean that in this measure 6, we now need to get the second violin sort of fairly busy to cover up for the fact that the first violin has dropped out. So how about we do something like this. And I'm really thinking about a bit of counterpoint with the cello part. I'm purposely going to keep it a little bit on the busy side because the first violin has dropped out. So we want this to, we don't want to think, oh dear, somebody's on a tea break. We want to feel that there's enough busyness going on elsewhere in the texture that we haven't missed the first violin, but we're feeling this slight difference in the texture. And then when the first violin comes back, it's a really kind of welcome, fresh entry. So that's kind of the thinking that's going on at this point. Yes, now then, how are we going to finish this off? Yes, I think we do something like this. Okay. So how does that measure go now? Well, let's have a look at the cello and the second violin part. So from the beginning of this measure, you see what I've done here, contrary motion. And that's quite a handy way to write. The bass is starting on B, A, G. So harmony note, a chord tone, passing note or a passing tone, onto a harmony note, a chord tone. B, A, G. Notice the second violin using the same three notes but going in the opposite direction. B, A, G, G, A, B. That kind of works quite nicely. Now, of course, when you're wanting two parts to run together, thirds and sixths are the ideal intervals to use because they're consonant intervals. You're not going to have too much trouble with them, but you've got to be sure that they fit with a harmony. So I'm already thinking, you know, we finished on this chord 1 in G, but then we're kind of heading for C, aren't we? So having a sort of 5 going on there is going to be quite important. So that's part of what I'm doing there. So what are we doing then? We've got this contrary motion and then I'm running in thirds. You see, all this is all in thirds. And then the bass leaps up, but I'm carrying on with the thirds. So the thirds work well. They're only going to work if they fit the harmony. So you can't just think, well, I'll just write something a third above or a sixth above or a third below or a sixth below, regardless of what chord that throws up. That's the sort of thing that creates trouble. But you can see that because I'm thinking I need to move from 1 in G to 5 in C, I've got all these notes fitting the harmony. So from that second beat of the bar, this is all 5. So harmony, passing, harmony, because that F makes the 5 into 5/7, doesn't it? And then this is all harmony, harmony, and then we've got a mixture of harmony and passing notes, passing tones, and it all works quite well. And then the violin entry comes as a sort of breath of fresh air. Violin 1, I mean. We think, ah, yes, here's our third voice back. But because I've been busy during that measure, we haven't felt like a hole has opened up. If I'd allowed the second violin to be a bit quiet in this measure, we'd have really felt a hole in it. You know, from the end of the previous bar, end of the previous measure, that would have felt like, oh, what's happened now? But we can allow one part to drop out if the other parts are still pretty active. And also you feel that second violin kind of rising up, almost taking some of the territory of the first violin and then coming back in to create a bit of space for the first violin to come in. So this is where we're going. Okay, let's go on and see what we can do next. Well, now you might think, well, if we're going to have this idea of giving people a bit of a break, why not do it in the second violin? Here's another little hint as well. If you're having to take an exam in counterpoint, I shouldn't really say this, should I? But if you put a few rests in, it saves you time. So that's worth thinking about. So why don't we now say, well, we've had this rest idea in the first violin. Let's let the second violin have a rest. That could be quite fun and again leaves a bit of air in the texture and means the next entry comes through with a kind of sort of freshness of attack. Now, in measure 7, I need to beware because if the first violin is only going to go in 8th notes in quavers, I mean, that's okay, but we've got a lot of 16th notes. The second violin is going to have a quarter note, a crotchet, and then stop. What's that telling me about the cello part? It means the cello part needs to be busy. So I need to get going, don't I, with kind of semi-quavers and so on. Okay, so I'm looking for a C major chord at this point, aren't I? We're looking for chord 1 in C major. And then we're kind of really going to chord 5 and then to chord 1 in the key of F. All right, so just so we're just keeping an eye and an ear on the harmony. So the bass part here, how about we do something like this? We're going to get busy with our 16th notes now. So if we do something like this, it don't have to be consistently 16th notes. I mean, I could do this. I'm using a rhythmic figure there that we've had before. Then I've just got to think about getting into F. So something like that. I mean, it slightly modifies the harmony, if I'm completely honest, that maybe we've got sort of the 5 is now over here, and I've got a kind of 2 in first inversion there. So, you know, that's fine. We can modify the harmony as long as we know where we're going with it. Now, what does that actually look like and sound like? We may just put in the next note. Remembering accidentals, of course, when we have to change key. So that means that measure 7 now goes. So you see how that works? Keeping the bass busy means that we don't sort of feel the absence of the second violin too much. And while we're trying to keep busy with those 16th notes, they don't want to be interminable either. So I've kind of struck a balance, haven't I, between 16th notes, the semiquavers and the bass, but not keeping that going all the way through. So the rhythm is then just slightly slower at the end of that bar, at the end of that measure. Okay, well, we're rolling on through this now and moving into the next bar. Well, again, you know, you've got to keep thinking about this harmony, haven't you? So we've gone to 1 in F, but it's also going to end up being a 5 in B flat. Why do I say that? Because of this E flat going on there. And then we've got to think, actually, by the time we get to the next measure, we're looking at 1 in G. So actually things are moving a bit faster in the modulatory scheme here. So maybe this needs to be a 5 in G. So instead of just going with the same kind of pace, 5, 1, now I'm thinking, oh, we've gone to 1 in B flat. Now let's go 5 to 1 in G a little bit faster. It just agitates the momentum of the piece a bit. You can agitate the momentum through the rhythm, but you can also do it through the harmonic rhythm. So that's something else to think about. Okay, let's see if we can get some notes in then. So thinking about this harmony and thinking about the other things we've just been talking about, let's get some 16th notes, some semiquavers in here, because the second violin is playing 8th notes, quavers, so we could do with a bit of movement going on here. And then maybe I'm going to share that with the cello a bit, so don't go mad on the 16th notes. We could do something like that. And then I've got to get into G, haven't I? So I need to think about how I'm going to do that. Something like this maybe. Okay, how does that look? Okay, and then maybe that. Now, on this occasion, I haven't put a rest in the first violin. You might be thinking, well, why don't you just have a rest before the next entry of the violin part? Well, if you do it every time, it becomes really predictable. So now, just for a change, we're not going to do it. You know, keep the listener guessing. Don't make life predictable. Now, we need to get the fundamentals of this harmony in the bass line. And while the bass has been kind of sitting around on the first beat of the bar, while the first violin's been busy, on the second beat, well, we've just got those 2 quavers, those 2 8th notes. So I'm thinking semiquavers, 16th notes down here. is probably what we want. So we get busy at the bottom. You see, you're kind of sharing the rhythmic business around. When we get to this point, well, we're very busy in the upper two parts. So I'm going to be less busy in the bass. You see how we're kind of ducking and diving with this stuff all the time. And then coming into the next bar, I'm probably going to be fairly busy in the bass again because you can see what's going on upstairs. So what does that amount to then? So we've got in this measure, so the key's on the move, where kind of modulation scheme is moving quicker. But hopefully you can see all the things that I've been talking about there. And we've got a kind of interesting melodic line, hopefully, in the first violin part. One of the dangers of counterpoint is you kind of get your main idea kind of going very nicely. And then the upper part maybe is just a bit boring, but hopefully this isn't. And the bass part, hopefully. You see how there's a bit of character going through all that. I mean, this all takes a little bit of time to get going, but hopefully that's making sense. Okay, let's roll on. And in the next measure, I'm just sort of thinking, well, you know, the excitement is building. Let's see if we can keep a bass line on the move. Now we've arrived on that 1 in G. We need to be thinking about 5 in C because of that F natural in the first violin part there. So you'll just keep that in mind. And then what are we going to do? Well, let's see if we can get busy in the bass line. How about this? Something like this might do the trick, mightn't it? Okay, so do you see I've filled up a whole bar there, a whole measure with 16th notes, semiquavers. Kind of works quite nicely, doesn't it? And you see some of those are chord tones or harmony notes. Some of them are auxiliary notes, neighbor tones. We've got some passing notes, passing tones. You're going to need all that stuff to make it work. Now, okay, I could keep that rhythmic value in the second violin, but maybe we'll just do a little bit of this running in thirds with the bass there. So because the first violin part is also just stopping for a quick breath at the beginning of that measure, keep it busy down there. And then we don't have to be too busy after that, do we? We could just sort of complete some harmony, fill out the chords a little bit, because we've got plenty of activity. We've got this new point upstairs, we've got all this busyness down here. So how does that work? Well, I'm going, you see these thirds going in the bottom parts as well, so that's kind of helpful. Sorry, it's a bit stretchy to play on a keyboard. That's one of the nice things about writing for strings. You don't have to worry about all that keyboard restriction. Okay, so let's roll on. Now we get to measure 10. Well, we're going to get to the point where we're going to be going into F major soon. So this is looking like 5 to 1 in F, isn't it? Whereas we're finishing our 1 on in the key of C at this point. So what should we do? Well, maybe let's keep this busy a little bit. One of the things to think about is when you come to the end of a point, if it just stops dead every time, you get this sort of stop-start feeling with the point. So sometimes it's kind of handy just to extend it for a moment, you know? And then I'm thinking, well, you know what? We kept going last time, didn't we, to the next point. So let's get back to having rests again. So we have a fresh entry in measure 11 in that first violin part. Okay, this bass part, after the last measure, we probably just want to finish that off, don't we? So we can do that. And we're in business. Now what I'm going to do in the second violin in measure 10, in bar 10, is kind of keep it simple at the beginning of the measure while the first violin is finishing off. And then I'm going to get busy in the rest of the bar. We used a tied note recently for the first time, so I'm going to do that again. If you introduce anything new, try to use it, usually at least 3 times within a movement. So that it doesn't sort of stick out, but feels like one of the consistent ideas that we're doing. So again, I'm using harmony notes here and non-chord tones in essential notes just to sort of fill in. And you see, I'm getting busy just where the first violin drops out. And then I'm thinking, let's get an F in there, and then we're all set to go in F major. So 10. So you see what we're doing there. Okie dokie, we're on our way. Now we're going to have to go later in this measure 5-1 in B flat. So new entry now in the first violin part. Okay, well, let's have a moment of busyness in the bass because the cello part wasn't too busy in the last bar. So let's kind of get cracking here. An upper neighbour tone, you notice with that B flat, upper auxiliary note, back to a harmony note, then a passing note. You see, you can kind of keep going on all this stuff. Now we're heading for this B flat thing. So maybe let's get an E flat in there, and then that's flagging up the new key. This all goes quite nicely as a scale, actually. And of course your passing tones, your passing notes, can be accented or unaccented. So I'm using a little bit of accented stuff to get down a scale run. If you can get a scale run in the bass every now and again, well, that's no bad thing. So do you see what I've got between the outer parts now? So that's where that's coming from. Okay, so now we need to get something in the middle. It doesn't need to be too busy in the middle because we're mighty busy with the bass part. I might just put a passing note in there, passing tone, and then we might just settle down for a moment and not get too active later in that measure. How does that work? So we've got... Okay, and then we could have a rest here, so we get a fresh start, but there's not much of a rest there, but it's a little bit of a fresh start. And then maybe I'm going to let the bass drop out for a while. We've had other people drop out for a while, so we'll have a little measure, a bar of duetting with the upper parts. Okay, so how's about we do a little bit of this next? Okay, so some 16th note movement there just to get going. I'm going to keep the 16th note, the semi-quaver movement going in the first violin part. Otherwise, it's rhythmically, it's going to sit down. So let's just get that going there. I'm going to stick an A flat in here because we're heading for a new key. And then I'll do that so we get harmony notes at the end of that measure. And of course what we're trying to do here is to go 5 in the key of E flat, so you can see what's going on there. So how does that measure look? So you see how that is? The bass part's dropped out, but we've just got the upper 2 parts. So a nice change of colour and texture, isn't it? But the main point of imitation, but something that's melodically alive. That kind of makes sense. You always got to think about voice leading. Does it sound right, or does it sound like we're just jumping to random notes? Hear the rhythmic independence of the 2 parts. Hear the busyness of that upper part. Okay, we're almost home and dry. Whew. So when we get to measure 13, okay, well, the bass has had a rest. Oops, that would be better in a different colour. I knew I was going to get this wrong at some point with the colours. So let's put a rest in there. Now this top part was quite busy, so can we keep it kind of going at this point? So maybe we could get into a E flat there to consolidate the key. So something like that. Now we're heading for this A flat, so we probably need to get a D flat in there, don't we? So if we do something, I'm keeping these rhythmic figures going that we've been using throughout the piece, so we're not introducing too many new ideas. And you know, this last one is a reversal of the previous rhythm. That's absolutely fine. And of course, you know, all the way through here, we've arrived on 1 in E flat, and now I'm heading for 5 in A flat at that point. Okay, now then, what about this middle part? Maybe we'll just keep busy for a bit, because I think we could make it more exciting on the approach to this cadence if we just keep the show moving. So how about this? Again, same old story, harmony notes, non-chord tones. That will need to be a B flat if I'm going to do that. Yes, and then we'll need a D flat at this point. And then we're kind of, dare I say it, home and dry. So you see what's going on in this bar then? And then we're into this Neapolitan and we've finished the piece. Okay, so now how does all this then play out? Something like this. I'm not saying this is the last word on it. There are things you can probably refine, but I'm hoping that just going through the process has been a really helpful exercise. Sounds something like this. Sorry. Just turn the page and sorry. Anyway, I hope that gives you a kind of rough idea what all that sounds like. So there we have it, a working of a piece of 3-part counterpoint. If you've enjoyed this video, then go to our website, www.mmcourses.co.uk, because there you will find access to all sorts of exciting things. All of our online courses in harmony, theory, oral work, orchestration, all sorts of things that will resource the musician. And while you're there, have a click on Maestros on the home page. That will tell you about this really exciting Maestros global community that we have as part of the Music Matters family. Lots of perks if you become a Maestro, reductions on our courses that are for sale, emojis, badges, access to behind the scenes material. You get advanced viewings on YouTube videos, lots of things like that. Also, a monthly live stream. There are 2 of them, in fact. And one is a kind of teaching input live stream where I do a lot of kind of teaching input, and it all runs with a live chat as well that people can participate in, which is great. And then we have another one which is kind of where people submit their own compositions, arrangements, harmony exercises, things like a counterpoint exercise maybe, to receive one-to-one feedback from me, and we share that in the group so we can all learn from each other. And it's a really lovely group of people, lots of people feeling they're on a rather lonely journey, and isn't it great to journey with others? And by involving themselves in the live chat, you can be passive if you want to be, but you can ask questions, you can share ideas with other people, and that's something that our members look forward to every month. So anyway, have a look and see if it's for you.